She was born into polygamy. Her family followed the teachings of Joseph Smith, including plural marriage. Like many young girls, she had been promised to a man who was her father's age. But she ran away. She chose hell over a life of polygamy. That girl was me. I was lost, alone, desolate. Then Jesus Christ found me and rescued me. In His love, I found real freedom. He is a shield to all who will take refuge in Him. This is why I can look back and ask, polygamy? What love is this? Welcome to our show again. This is Polygamy, What Love Is This? And I'm your host, Doris Hanson, and we're thankful that you've joined us. Of course, we do broadcast weekly on a weekly schedule so that we can continue to bring to the table information about early Mormon and, of course, contemporary polygamy. We focus on Mormon polygamy simply because it changes the gospel of Jesus Christ from grace into polygamy for salvation. And if polygamy, it takes polygamy to become saved, then of course polygamy becomes the Savior instead of Jesus Christ. Before we get started, I'd like to make an announcement about the movie Prophets Pray that's going to soon be released in various theaters around the country. Prophets Pray, the book, was written by Sam Brower, and it was the inspiration for the film. It's the disturbing and shocking inside story of Warren Jeffs and the FLDS polygamy group. Now, polygamy groups are all patriarchal, secret religions, but Warren Jeffs ruled the FLDS with an iron fist and depraved sexual exploitation. He brought child rape up to a new low and placed the blame on God. The movie will be showing in Salt Lake City on Friday, October 2nd at 7 p.m. It will be at the Broadway Center Theater at 111 East Broadway in downtown Salt Lake City, and we urge all of our viewers to go and watch it if you possibly can. Now, our show this time is the second part of two parts on a discussion about the polygamy essays that have been posted on the official LDS.org website, where the LDS leaders have finally admitted that Joseph Smith did have somewhere between 30 and 40 secret plural wives. Now, for polygamists, it's no big deal. But for many of the mainline Mormons, they are shocked to hear that what their critics have been saying all along turned out to be true. Despite decades of denial by the mainstream LDS church leaders, even calling those who talked about it anti-Mormon liars. And our returning guest for this discussion is Sandra Tanner. She is the owner and the operator of the Utah Lighthouse Ministry in Salt Lake City. So I would like to introduce and welcome back Sandra. Thanks again, Sandra, for being here again. Yeah. Of course, like last time, we're basing our discussion on your newsletter. It's newsletter number 124, entitled Problems in the LDS Essays on Plural Marriage. So tell our viewers if they can still get this newsletter and how they can get it and where your bookstore is.
Right. We have a bookstore, Utah Lighthouse, at 1358 South on West Temple in Salt Lake City. And if they just drop me a note there or go through our website at utlm.org, they can just request it. It's sent free. Mm-hmm. And we still have copies left of this edition. And this newsletter has many details and footnotes here. So if people hear us talking about something and they say, well, how do I know that's true? They get the newsletter, it'll give them the references, and then they can look it up themselves.
And that's one thing you've done in all your work is make sure that every footnote, everything is backed up by footnotes and resources, references. It's great. Well, we're going to get started again. We left, I think, off on page 8 of your newsletter, where we're just going point by point through some of the discussion that you did with it. But I'm going to start with the word concubine.
Yes.
The Easton's Bible Dictionary defines concubine as, and I quote, a wife of secondary rank. They had no authority in the family, nor could they share in the household government. It was a woman who cohabits with a man without being his wife, a paramour, and a wife of inferior condition. So, based on that Bible description of what a concubine is, did the early Mormons have concubines? Do they admit to having concubines or deny it?
Well, that's a good question. Why is it in the Revelation? Now, most Mormons haven't read section 132 and paid attention to the wording, but it says God approved of wives and concubines for David and Solomon. So who are the concubines? Now, wives of second class, actually, I think Joseph's wives would fall in that. In the Bible, a concubine would not have rights of inheritance.
Right.
Well, none of Joseph's plural wives had rights of inheritance. So would that have made them concubines? The Mormons never explained to us who fits in that category.
Right, right. And it says that it's a wife of inferior condition. And so you don't have as much say as the first wife. And that really is true in the polygamy groups.
Yes.
I'm telling you. If the man has a favorite wife, usually it's the first wife, but not always. Sometimes he'll have a favorite wife and she rules the roost for rule and ruling over the other wives.
Right.
So but they wouldn't call themselves concubines.
No.
They wouldn't refer to that. The next heading is motivation for recording the revelation. And I want to quote, it's on page 8, and I quote, the opening essay reads, the same revelation that taught of plural marriage was embedded within a revelation about eternal marriage, the teaching that marriage could last beyond death, end quote. Now, it's doubtful that very many Mormons or even polygamists really understand the so-called plural marriage revelation was dictated, why it was dictated in the first place, and how. So why don't you tell them how and why?
Well, Joseph Smith had already been living polygamy for a couple of years minimum before this revelation's recorded. So it wasn't a matter of getting this revelation first and then him saying, oh my, I guess I'm going to have to start doing this. He already had a couple of dozen wives before this gets recorded. But the reason for the recording is that Joseph can't get Emma to consent to him taking plural wives. And so his brother Hiram, who has recently been converted to the principle, says to Joseph, well, if you'll just write it down, I'll take it to Emma, and I'm sure I can get her to approve of this. And Joseph says to Hiram, you don't know Emma like I do. Well, Hiram's convinced he can do this, so he gets him to write it down. A copy was also made of the revelation. That wasn't the only one. But anyways, Hiram goes off with this revelation to read it to Emma. When he comes back, and Joseph essentially says, well, how'd it go? And Hiram says, I never received such a severe talking to in my life. And that's Mormon sources. I mean, this isn't hearsay. This is their own sources that record this.
Yeah, Emma would. Yeah, she just and then he said something like, "Well, I told you, I knew Emma better than you did." So there were other polygamists at that time besides just Joseph Smith.
Yes.
And even though it was all kept top secret, there were many men who were living polygamy.
By the time Joseph Smith dies in 1844, so it's a year after the revelation, there were approximately 24 Mormon men in Nauvoo that were practicing polygamy. But by the time they leave, a few years later, there are almost 200 men. But at the time Joseph Smith dies, he had got a couple dozen of his close followers to go into it.
But Emma wasn't the first wife that was actually sealed to him.
Oh, no, he's sealed to Louisa Beeman in 1841. Before Emma, I mean, he's got a couple dozen of them are sealed to him before Emma.
Before Emma was.
She couldn't get her sealing until she agreed to polygamy.
That's right.
So
That's right.
He wants to marry some wives, and Emma is holding back. And finally she says, okay, well, if I get to pick them. And Joseph says, okay, who do you pick? And she picks 2 sisters that were living there in the home. The Partridge sisters, and rather than tell Emma that he had already married them, the women, grown women, later in their life tell that they went through a second ceremony for Emma's benefit. Rather than tell Emma, we already married Joseph without your consent, they went through a second ceremony just for her.
I wonder if she ever found that out.
Yeah, I
Emma.
don't know.
Yeah.
But that was to guarantee her eternal life, that she consents to these girls.
Right, absolutely. And that's what I want to quote for next. I want to quote Doctrine Covenants, section 132:64, where it says, I say unto you, if any man have a wife who holds the keys of this power, and he teaches her the law of my priesthood, as pertaining to these things, and that's plural marriage, then shall she believe and administer unto him, or she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord your God, for I will destroy her. Now, there's some, that's flashback to me stuff, you know, I mean, we got that when we were growing up, and most polygamous groups just continue to use that. But it's a lot, thus saith the Lord. I mean, this is from God, and threatening destruction. But the irony of all this is Emma never did accept polygamy, but she lived to a ripe old age.
Yes, she outlived Joseph.
By a long shot.
Yes, by many, many years. Right.
It's almost like God's poetic justice in turning that back on him.
Yeah. Well, and the Mormons will say sometimes that they don't need to worry. God will never allow the prophet to lead them astray. He would take them out of office. And I said, well, did you ever think about the fact that he took Joseph Smith out of office? Mm-hmm. I mean, he died young.
He did. And it was quite dramatic and quite sudden, too.
And directly related to polygamy. The whole reason for him being in jail was because of someone blowing the whistle on his polygamy.
And that's the whole thing with the Nauvoo
Expositor.
Yeah, and if we have time, we'll talk about that a little bit. On page 9, under the heading "Threatened by an Angel."
Yes.
This is not quite my favorite, but I want to quote from the essay "Plural Marriage" in Kirtland and Nauvoo. Joseph told associates that an angel appeared to him 3 times between 1834 and 1842 and commanded him to proceed with plural marriage when he hesitated to move forward. During the 3rd and final appearance, the angel came with a drawn sword, threatening Joseph with destruction unless he went forward and obeyed the commandment fully. You know, it seems like we read over and over again, God's going to destroy you. You know, he just calls down destruction so many times in different ways. But he also used this same destruction thing in his plural marriage proposals. That's quite a way to get a marriage proposal, isn't it?
Oh, right.
You marry me or else.
Right. And, Mormons need to go back and read section 132. Most of them have not paid attention to the threats given to Emma and to any woman that has this principle revealed to her. Yeah. I mean, they're all threatened with destruction if they don't accept this. I don't recall that it threatened the men that way.
No, none of the men.
Women.
None of the men. The men were told that they needed to do it, but there wasn't any threats like that. Now, about this angel that he claimed came to threaten him, he was already a polygamist when he claims the angel came and told him he better start living polygamy.
Right. I don't understand this whole thing about why an angel needed to come and demand that he enter into polygamy when he had already entered into it. And there's at least 2 of the married women that claim that he told them that the angel came and said he had to live this.
Yeah.
Well, why? The women were already married. Why would the angel be concerned that he married them in polygamy?
That's
why
a
not
good question.
Just go to all the single women? Well, he seemed to get a lot of them, but I find that one of the things that disturbs people above other things in the polygamy issue is the polyandry, which is a woman having more than one husband. And Mormons don't usually have a grasp of this, that Joseph was practicing polyandry. He was marrying women that already had a husband.
That's exactly right. And you call this angel story spiritual blackmail.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, can you imagine going to a young woman? I mean, this is the prophet of God, according to them. He speaks for God. This is like Moses coming to you and saying, you need to take me as your husband, or this angel is going to kill me. Well, what kind of a God is that?
Yes, that's a good question. And how does this fit in with the doctrine of free agency?
Yes, one would wonder.
For sure. And that's what I wondered a lot, too. This is exactly the way modern-day polygamists are operated, exactly the same way. There really is very little difference. And then there's the secrecy of Joseph Smith's polygamy. None of his plural wives were ever publicly acknowledged.
Many of them didn't even know each other as plural marriage.
That was going to be my next question. How many of them knew about each other?
Very few. A few of the girls there that lived in the Smith home, he had kind of like a boarding house. A few of them knew of different ones that were plural wives, but the extent of it wasn't known. And it becomes obvious when, 1887 or whenever, that the article comes out in the Return here in, or the historical record here in Salt Lake, where Andrew Jensen, Mormon historian, and also Joseph F. Smith had gone around interviewing and collecting statements from all the people that used to be in Nauvoo about his polygamy. And through that all, we can see that most of the women didn't know each other and didn't know what the list was.
And didn't know that the others were married to him.
Right.
In fact, the Relief Society, he would get up and speak to all these women and talk about, all the morality and poor Emma.
Yes. Here's Emma at the Relief Society meeting, not realizing that probably half the women in the room have been secretly married to Joseph. But many of the women in that room that had been married to him wouldn't have known about the other women in the room that had been married to him.
Right. So so secrecy was extremely
on every
important
side.
At that. Okay, let's talk about the Nauvoo Expositor. They left it out in the essays. They didn't discuss it. They didn't bring it up and what that was all about, the relationship to Joseph Smith's polygamy, and ultimately his death.
Right.
Now, the reason that the prophet died should be well known, shouldn't it? So since they didn't talk about it, why don't we talk about it?
Right.
Explain it to our viewers.
Right. Well, so you have now for at least 3 years, you've had Joseph Smith secretly going around behind the scenes, marrying all these different women, getting a couple dozen of his close leaders involved in living polygamy. But not everyone was comfortable with this. There was opposition in top leadership. And William Law and his brother and a couple other men also were very upset about this. They knew about it secretly, but nothing had been put in the papers about it from the Mormon side. And so William Law went to Joseph and pleaded with him to give this all up. Well, I should back up. One of the things that really set off the laws was Joseph had gone and asked Jane Law to be his plural wife, and that kind of set things off with William. But William pleaded with Joseph to give up all this polygamy, and Joseph wouldn't back down on it. And when William Law became aware of the Lawrence sisters, that were two sisters living in the Smith home, Joseph Smith was their legal guardian and in charge of their estate. And he felt that Joseph was taking advantage of these girls. So he filed a lawsuit against Joseph on adultery and misusing their funds. William and some other men set up the Nauvoo Expositor and opposition press in Nauvoo, but these were Mormon men. This isn't anti-Mormon, non-Mormons.
Right.
He still believed Mormonism, and he wanted to set up a Reformed church that wouldn't have polygamy. So this is a friend that's trying to get him to desist, and he can't get Joseph to back down. So they put out this newspaper. Joseph, as mayor, orders the destruction of the press, and they did destroy the whole thing. This led to all kind of problems and threat of riot in town and such. So Joseph eventually gets arrested for this and is put in Carthage jail awaiting a hearing on it. And the citizenry around Nauvoo were fed up with the Mormons. They thought they were just some crazy cult out there and wanted to get rid of the whole thing. So they stormed the jail and killed Joseph Smith. I wish they'd have left him alone and let him go to court, because I think it would have put an end to Mormonism and it would have exposed all of his terrible inner teachings. But it was his own people that were blowing the whistle on his polygamy.
It was. And I don't believe that most mainstream Mormons realize that that's exactly what happened.
Right.
That it was his polygamy.
Oh yeah, the movies they show on Joseph's
they show
life, they don't explain why he gets arrested.
Yeah.
They show him getting arrested, but they don't tell why.
And they just make it seem like that he was like a lamb
Yes.
led to the slaughter.
Right.
Is what I've heard all my life, and of course that is not true.
Yeah.
Plural Marriage in Utah, you quoted from the essay about the practice of polygamy in Utah, and I quote, "Women and men who lived within plural marriages attested to challenges and difficulties, but also to the love and joy they found within their families." This is like fingernail scratching on the blackboard to me, besides that, according to the historical record, did Emma, I mean, what we read, did Emma find
No.
joy in all of this?
No, the whole scenario for Joseph Smith's polygamy is one of heartache. Emma went through agony over this. People need to read her biography,
Yes.
Mormon Enigma, the story of Emma Smith, and it shows the heartache and turmoil in the home. She threatens to divorce Joseph Smith at times. She had a horrible life, and even out here in Utah, they had horrible times with this. Brigham Young got up in conference one time and said he's tired of all these women complaining, and come the next October or whatever date he gave, he says, "I'm gonna set you all free, because I'm not gonna have any more of this arguing, complaining, and bickering going on. Either shut up or ship out." It's just an amazing
And that's
sermon.
in the Journal of Discourses.
Yes.
The sermon is there, and if everybody was so happy and had all this love and joy, the essays make it sound like they had, there would have been no need for a sermon like that.
No. And his own wife, my great-great-grandma, Mary Ann Angel, she made a statement at one time that if God doesn't compensate all the plural wives for all the misery they've been through, he will be very unjust.
That's right. That's right, because it is misery. And it's the same in polygamy groups today. It's the same misery. People don't change. The love that they need and resources from their husband hasn't changed. Another quote you quoted from Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness, and I quote, "Compton gives further insight into the lives of those living celestial marriage. Polygamist wives often experienced what was essentially acute neglect. Despite the husband's sincere efforts, he could only give a specific wife a fraction of his time and means," end quote. Actually, that's the brutal truth of polygamy.
Right.
Then and now, it's not the love and joy that the LDS claimed it was at all. And it's a very sad thing, and I want to thank you for bringing that out in your newsletter, because some of these glamour reality shows, that show polygamy, they don't show the truth of what it's really like behind the scenes.
Well, you have in the newsletter I talk about Brigham Young when you realize that he married over 55 women in plural marriage, he had around 56 children, but those children were only by 16 wives. Why only 16 wives when he married dozens more than that? But he goes on at one point to explain that it's none of those wives' business how often he visits them, whether it's once a year or every 3 years. It's none of their business. And I'm thinking, oh, well, swell, that's a great marriage. That obviously he had very little to do with a lot of these women.
In fact,
very lonely.
He made a statement that he preferred the company of men than women any day.
Well, he spent all his time with the company of men, it seems like, in running the church. To have 56 children, how would a man give those children the sense of family, a father, of direction in their life? I know his one daughter wrote stuff later saying that what a wonderful life they had in the Beehive House. But I think that's a very selective telling of the children's story. I'd like to hear all of their stories. I don't think they all had that
They couldn't have.
good of a life.
They couldn't have. Numerically, it would have been an impossibility for them to have it. The percentage of men and women is always been a misinformation in Mormon polygamy. And you quote in the essay that two-thirds of the polygamous men had only 2 wives, and then they admitted that 2/3 only had 2. If they admitted that 2/3 had only 2 wives, how many of the wives did the other third have? And so that you list 75 men that had prominent Mormon men that had over 6 wives?
Yeah, right.
So the percentage of how many of them lived polygamy has been downplayed by the Mormon Church during all this time.
Yes, I had a lady in the store the other day that said that she had gone through the list in there where I have how many had 8 how many had 7, how many had 6 wives, you know, on the list of at the end of their stay in Nauvoo. And she says that she found her great-great-grandfather enlisted and didn't realize that he had had as many wives as was listed in the research.
Well, we're getting down close to our time being over, but I want to cover a few other things. So what I would like to do is quote something from Joseph F. Smith, who was the 6th LDS president, in the Journal of Discourses, and I think you quoted in your newsletter, where he said, quote, "I understand the law of celestial marriage to mean that every man in this church who has the ability to obey and practice it in righteousness and will not shall be damned. I say I understand it to mean this and nothing less, and I testify in the name of Jesus that it does mean that." Now, this is one place where if a man doesn't live it, he will be damned. Of course,
Right.
Brigham Young said that often. According to the LDS teaching, shouldn't the LDS Church be practicing polygamy today?
Yes, one would think. This is the case of ignoring what prophets have said in the past. And they always say, well, we are only bound by what the living prophet says. Well, how is that? Then why use the Book of Mormon? Why use the Doctrine Covenants? Why use the Bible? Those are all past prophets to them.
Yeah. That's right. Now, we only have a few seconds left before closing. So you concluded by quoting Matthew 7:16 and 17, "By their fruits you shall know them."
Yes.
What fruits do they ignore of this polygamy? Take a few seconds.
Well, the fruits of polygamy are lying, deceit, heartache, coercion, misuse of God's word, threats with destruction. Those are all fruits of that. And all the polygamists out there today are the fruits of Joseph
Right.
Smith's polygamy.
That's
Mormons don't want to own up to this, that we wouldn't have a Warren Jeffs
That's
if
right.
it wasn't for Joseph Smith.
And I can attest to that, growing up in a polygamy group, and that's exactly what happened. Well, thanks again, Sandra,
Yes.
for coming. Again, get her book, or for her newsletter, call her, and she'll send it right out to you. It's very interesting. And as Sandra said, either God ordered polygamy or Joseph Smith was a false prophet. If God ordered polygamy, then all Mormons should still be practicing polygamy. And if God ordered it and they aren't practicing it, then the LDS Church is wrong today. If God didn't command polygamy and the early Mormons practiced it without his command, then the foundation of Mormonism is wrong, so today's LDS Church is wrong. Either way, they're wrong. We always remind our viewers that Jesus is the focus, not polygamy, not the United Order, and not Joseph Smith. In fact, following a man's doctrine leads to an eternity without God, without Jesus, and without your family. We hope that you'll turn to Jesus and follow only him and follow only what he taught, and he never taught polygamy. See you next time on Polygamy. What Love Is This?